group debate discussion is the use of restraints and seclusion for people with autism and other developmental disabilities. First, I'll start off with an introduction to our group members. I'm Melissa, I'll be our introducer, and I'm from Utah. Next, we have Maddie, who's our summarizer, and she's from Southern Indiana. Beth is our researcher. She's from Richmond, Indiana. And then Katie is our illustrator from Annapolis, Maryland. And then last we have Tresley, our fielder from Southern Indiana. So the topic of our debate was the use of restraints and seclusion for people with autism and other developmental disabilities. Beginning our debate, we'll first be discussing the pro research we have studied about the use of restraints and seclusion for people with autism and other developmental disabilities. The pro points that we'll start with are first, the use of comfort rooms and voluntary seclusion for those with ASD to manage their behaviors. Our second point, supporting the use of seclusion and restraint, is that these techniques provide protection of others from aggressive behaviors, as well as protection of the client or student from hurting themselves. For our last pro point, we'll discuss how not intervening while a client engages in self-injurious behavior can be viewed as a form of abuse. First, we'll hear from Maddie, our summarizer. Next will be Beth, our researcher. And last will be from Katie, who is our illustrator.
Okay, so our first points, like Melissa said, although seclusion and restraint remains controversial, there is still a need for these procedures for times when self-injurious behaviors are occurring or aggression towards others. The first point, as Melissa mentioned, is the use of comfort rooms or voluntary seclusion. Comfort rooms are a type of voluntary seclusion, and they can be used to keep those individuals safe and also those that are working with the individual. Comfort rooms are a place for individuals to go when they are starting to feel anxious or angry or upset. These rooms really allow the client to be secluded from others, but also work through their feelings at the same time. The second point is that the use of seclusion and restraint helps to protect others that are working with the individuals. When individuals become aggressive or angry towards the staff or themselves, they can cause injuries. By restraining or secluding these individuals who are causing harm, it's possible for us to stop them from hurting themselves even more so. When individuals have become aggressive to staff using restraint and seclusion, it helps to stop the aggression and protect staff. Our final point is that when an individual engages in self-injurious behaviors, they have the ability to cause injuries to themselves depending on how serious the behavior is, and this can be viewed as a form of abuse. Not intervening with the use of seclusion or restraint to stop those behaviors can be formed as abuse due to the fact that when the staff is allowing the individual to cause harm to their body, they can give themselves damage or cause really serious injuries to themselves.
Thanks, Maddie. Next, we'll hear from Beth, who is our researcher.
Comfort rooms were established out of the need to include clients' input about interventions in their treatment. 92% of those who have used comfort rooms found them to be beneficial. Comfort rooms or voluntary seclusion promotes the use of self-management techniques when individuals feel stressed or in crisis. Clients were involved in the design of the comfort rooms. They helped to choose everything from pictures on the walls to furniture that was used in the rooms. By using comfort rooms, the use of traditional seclusion lessened, while more used comfort rooms instead. For the first 4 months after the use of comfort rooms began, there were 0 restraints. There was a reduction in client-to-client assaults by 23%, also a reduction in client-to-staff assaults by 48%. 14 clients filled out voluntary feedback forms after using the comfort rooms during the first 4 months. 8 clients stated that the room lowered their levels of distress, and all stated that the comfort rooms helped them. There have been other studies of individuals who have been restrained or placed in seclusion supporting the use of restraints and seclusion. Some individuals have found out that being restrained or placed in a seclusion provides some type of comfort for them, especially if paired with those performing the restraint or placing in seclusion speaks softly, or the person placing them in seclusion speaks softly to them, or gives them simple instructions, or provides some type of comfort to them. Saurander and colleagues reported that some children felt safe when an adult was restraining them. They received the restraint as showing a calming, caring effect. Staff also can experience positive emotions from using restraint or placing in seclusion. They felt like they were helping when engaging in the restraint or placing in seclusion. As stated earlier, most are against using restraints and seclusion unnecessarily, but there are times when the safety of the individuals and others would call for the use of restraints and seclusion. When these times occur, strict guidelines must be in place. One study by Ryan and his colleagues included the use of Crisis Prevention Institute, CPI, which provides guidelines on when and how restraints or seclusion can be used. Ryan and Associates studied a small school in Minnesota. This was a public day school serving grades K through 12. The staff at the school had recently trained extensively with Crisis Prevention Institute's CPI method. Also to note that this is a nonviolent crisis intervention, and it's also a training that most school districts use. CPI focuses on identifying maladaptive behaviors, choosing appropriate interventions, using nonverbal techniques to not instigate situations, but help to de-escalate behaviors and situations. These strategies learned help to prevent the need for restraints or seclusion. The program does acknowledge that there are times when restraints or seclusion must occur for the physical safety for all those involved. When this occurs, the program focuses on nonviolent physical interventions as well as a team intervention. Ryan and colleagues followed the school for 2 years and their use of CPI. Prior to the start of receiving CPI training, it was reported that 25 students were placed in seclusion 439 times. The number of timeouts ranged from a single event to a maximum of 43 times. Year 2 of the study indicated that 21 students were sent to seclusion for a total of 266 times. This was a 39% reduction in seclusion. And during year 1, 15 students were sent to timeouts more than 10 times. And during the second year, only 4 students were sent to seclusion or timeout more than 10 times. Restraints was reduced from 68 the first year to 39 the second year. The use of CPI by staff helped to reduce the need for restraints and seclusion, but provided a nonviolent crisis intervention if needed.
Thank you, Beth. Next, we'll hear from Katie, our illustrator.
All right, thank you, Melissa. All right. So CIVAC implemented a recovery model that wanted to see if using comfort rooms might be one possible way to reduce the use of seclusion and restraint. A comfort room is defined as a type of sanctuary for patients to go to experience their feelings of anger or anxiety in a safe way, as well as a place where they are able to engage in a variety of different sensory activities. Access to the comfort room is voluntary, but if staff sense an individual is escalating, they can suggest its use. Different items in the room include comfortable chairs, a large TV with DVDs that play calming scenes, stress balls, materials to write or draw, as well as different soothing scents. So here's an example of the feedback form that Beth was talking about earlier that individuals can complete after they use the comfort room. So results did indicate that over the 4 months, the comfort room, oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. Just realized. Oh no, I'm missing, oh, there we go, sorry. The feedback form was completed 14 times by 26 eligible participants. 8 participants reported that the comfort room was able to lower their overall stress by a level of at least 2 points. During the 4-month period, there were 0 reported instances of seclusion and restraint being utilized in this facility. Okay, I'm backtracking. So in 2009, Kurth and colleagues wanted to see what effects non-contingent self-restraint would have on self-injurious behaviors. By pairing non-contingent access to a sweatshirt, they were able to decrease the self-injurious behavior of a 16-year-old male with autism and moderate intellectual disabilities. Results from the study indicated that one of the maintaining variables of the self-injury was being denied access to the sweatshirt, which he would pull over his head as a way to stop himself from engaging in self-injury. And you can see from the graph that when the boy was denied access to the hooded sweatshirt, the amount of self-injurious behavior increased. However, when the boy was allowed access to the sweatshirt, the instances he engaged in self-injury decreased. Sorry. Nope. Technical difficulties. Thank you for being patient. Okay, so in 2013, researchers in Quebec wanted to explore the feelings individuals with intellectual disabilities felt about being restrained, in addition to the attitude of the care providers responsible for restraining. Although results indicated a more negative experience with restraint and seclusion, there were a few individuals who reported feeling happiness and having a sense of predictability while being restrained. Another indicated that they enjoyed restraint because it led to them being in a calm state of mind. So care providers also reported that the use of restraint led to the service user being much calmer than prior to the restraint being utilized.
Okay, thank you, Katie. So next, we will talk about our cons. So we'll shift our discussion to the cons about using seclusion or restraint on those with ASD. Our first point, we'll discuss the lack of sufficient training with the support staff. This may result in the overuse of restraint or seclusion and a lack of operational definitions for the behaviors. The next point is the safety concern for both clients and the support staff when seclusion or restraints are used. The last con point is that restraint only suppresses problem behaviors and how management of behaviors does not generalize to other settings. Now we'll hear from Maddie, the summarizer, Beth, the researcher, Katie, illustrator, and concluding the debate will be Tresley, our fielder.
Thank you, Melissa. So for our con points, we first have that when support staff is not properly trained to de-escalate situations, they are more likely to have to resort to restraint and seclusion. Overusing restraint and seclusion can not only be harmful to the individuals that are having it done to them, but also the individuals that are having to be part of these restraints. Restraints are being used more often in situations where there is a lack of alternative interventions in place. Our second point is the implementation of restraint and seclusion can have safety concerns for individuals and staff. There have been physical consequences to restraint, such as different types of injuries, exhaustion, and even death in some cases. This overuse is harmful not only physically, but it's also harmful mentally and emotionally for everybody involved. And our last point, using restraint and seclusions suppresses problem behaviors instead of working through these behaviors. So restraint should be more often used in emergency situations where there's a direct harm to those involved, and alternative solutions should be used first before restraint and seclusion to see if there's other ways to work through it. Not only that, but how these behaviors are being handled with seclusion and restraint cannot be generalized in other settings, such as the individual's home life.
Next, we'll hear from Beth, our researcher.
Support staff often have not been trained adequately to or choose not to follow the training that they have been given or when to restrain or use seclusion. In a study completed by Ryan and his colleagues, he noted that the staff had been effectively trained on the use of CPI, but in studies found that seclusion was overused by the staff. 32% of students were sent to seclusion for being non-compliant. It is important to note that timeout should have been given before being sent to seclusion, and it appeared that staff was skipping the step of going to timeout first. Ryan and colleagues were also concerned with the number of restraints. 48% of students were being restrained due to being non-compliant. Restraints and seclusion should be used as a last resort, like if someone is hurting themselves or fear of others being physically harmed. The study indicated that restraint and seclusion was being used when there was not a threat of physical aggression. In another study, Trader and colleagues noted that there have been documented abuses of dangers associated with restraint and seclusion. In that study, it focused on a public school. Their findings indicated that if restraint and seclusion is used inappropriately, this typically happens due to the absence of planning, such as a behavior intervention plan being in place, lack of training or coaching of staff, or lack of any administrative involvement by the school or school system. In the same study, it was reported that the U.S. Department of Education reported in the years 2011 to 2012 that either restraint or seclusion was used in the U.S. schools at least 110,000 times in a single school year. They also reported that students with disabilities are more likely to be restrained or placed in seclusion. In their study, as I said, they focused on public school. And during a 3-year period between 2011 to 2014, 16 students experienced either seclusion or restraint across 52 separate incidents. That averages out a little over 17 incidents a year. It's also important to note that 75% of these students were students with IEPs or individualized education programs. Furthermore, in this study, Trader and colleagues reported that the National Disability Rights Network in 2009 reported out that there had been a wide variety of abuses of seclusion. These reports of abuse included instances where physical injury takes place because of self-injury with cutting, pounding, or head banging, also psychological trauma, even suicide. Students in seclusion have also been denied access to going to the bathroom and food and water. In another study, Westling and colleagues noted that the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates released a report that documented over 180 cases of children being traumatized or hurt by the use of seclusion or restraints or other adverse procedures in schools. They also reported that those between the ages of 6 to 10 years of age with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder or another behavior disorder were most often restrained or placed in seclusion. And it's not just the clients or students who are being hurt during restraints or with the use of seclusion. It's also the staff. And it's not just physical. Hawkins and Associates documented feelings of staff of being fearful, angry, worried, shocked, sadness, or frustration when taking part in a physical or restraint or placing someone in seclusion. It is suggested that the staff may benefit from being taught emotion coping strategies such as stress or anger management skills, which they can use to reduce their levels of stress or anger throughout a physical intervention process. It is also to be noted that using restraints and seclusion isn't just a way to help someone calm down or keep themselves safe. Sometimes restraints and seclusion provide an opportunity for those being restrained or placed in seclusion to gain attention from others. Schreiner and colleagues provided us with an example of someone using themselves as being restrained as a way to show how fearless and tough they were to others. It was not being used, they were not using it therapeutically. Finally, according to Schreiner and colleagues, restraints or seclusion is paired exclusively with certain interventions, and those interventions do not generalize to the natural settings outside of the restraints or seclusion. So using restraints or seclusion do not add much to teaching clients or students how to self-manage their behaviors.
Thanks, Beth. So next is Katie, our illustrator.
All right, thank you, Melissa. Okay, so one of the negative facets associated with the use of seclusion and restraint with individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities is the lack of training in the area of de-escalating an individual who is close to or is in crisis. Adults are so accustomed to jumping right into restraint that they overlook the less restrictive measures, which could have led to restraint being avoided. Right. So in 2009, Schreiner conducted a study in an inpatient facility. The facility housed adolescents diagnosed with intellectual disabilities that had extensive histories of aggression and self-injurious behaviors. The study was conducted in 2 phases, an assessment phase and an intervention phase. One piece of the assessment phase involved interviewing the staff members who worked with these adolescents. They were interviewed about the reality of the services that they provided. And what researchers found was a major discrepancy in what was considered to be appropriate usage of seclusion and restraint. Some of those myths are outlined here. Some staff members were under the impression that patients should be placed in a restraint if they hit, gave a menacing look, spit, engaged in self-injury, or became aggressive. It had become so commonplace that staff thought seclusion and restraint were ingrained in the actual behavior plans that they were implementing. So out of all the myths, all of the myths ended with the clients being placed in restraint, yet not one mentioned de-escalation techniques of any kind that could have been used to avoid restraint. All right. So during the intervention phase, there were 4 different supports put in place to reverse, to decrease the amount of seclusion and restraint that was being used. So meetings were held more frequently where the goals and directives for the reduction of these techniques were defined and reviewed with staff. Staff had buy-in through potential benefits that decreasing seclusion and restraint had. and they were encouraged to view every crisis event as an opportunity to employ less restrictive interventions. So although they were able to show a functional relationship between the interventions and the decrease of seclusion and restraint, there's no indication as to whether or not these interventions would generalize to the natural environment. So one of the cons of using seclusion and restraint is that it is an immediate solution to a problem, but can create long-term damage if and when the client does not use these interventions and generalize them to other environments. All right, so another concern with using seclusion and restraint is that restraint has become the preference for some programs and staff members when less intrusive interventions have yet to be tried. Here is a graph that was pulled from a study published in 2012 by Jensen and colleagues. In this study, mechanical restraints were used to protect a 28-year-old woman with autism, intellectual disabilities, and bipolar disorder from biting herself. So she was biting herself so hard that she was actually creating irreversible nerve damage. So luckily, researchers were able to identify that by simply giving her a choice of which staff member she wanted to work with each day, they were able to decrease the amount of biting that she engaged in. And so ultimately were able to reduce the amount of restraint that they were using on this individual. All right, and finally, I'm going to talk about one final negative aspect of seclusion and restraint, and it is the physical effects that it has on the individuals implementing it, as well as financial effects. So financially, it's very expensive for these companies to implement these interventions when lots of employees are getting hurt while using them. So in 2009, Sanders decided to report on staff safety data. And what she found was that after implementing a 4-component intervention package, not only did the instances of restraint decrease, but so did the amount of money that this facility paid for lost time and replacement labor costs. So in total, there was a 93% reduction in expenses when employees injured themselves from using restraint and seclusion with clients.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Last, we'll hear from Tresley, our fielder, who will sum up the debate.
Thank you, Melissa. Here are a few questions that will help us wrap up that came in during the debate. First question, there seems to be many studies that support restraints and/or seclusions when they're justified by company guidelines. There's also just as many studies that are opposed to restraints and seclusions. Creating a comfort room and the use of CPI were just some of those options that was discussed during the debate. Are there any other current studies that are offering options to seclusion and/or restraints? Yes. To reiterate a strategy that Katie had brought to our attention, a report in the Journal of Applied Research studies showed that when clients were allowed to choose their staff, who they worked with, they had positive results for the day. In fact, the study showed a 50% decrease in the use of mechanical restraints when addressing SIBs. So just by taking a few minutes to choose the staff they preferred to work with made a daily impact on the time they spent in mechanical restraints. In fact, the results showed that it was cut down to 3 hours a day, which for this individual was a savings of 45.6 days a year. Another article that was listed in Perspectives in Psychiatric Care outlines how a team used a non-traditional consultation process with a focus on patient consultation. This study was conducted in a residential setting with a 35-bed unit and consisted more of a patient and team consultation with a heavy focus on building rapport with patients and a modified structure and routine daily. The efforts here consisted of a reduction of restraints over a month period from 36 to 0. Another question came in. Today, it would seem that many are focused on managing the restraint or seclusion safety, and that's where training seems to be focused. Is this a human rights issue? Are the rights of this population being ignored, denied, or limited by the use of restraints and seclusions? Yes. When you're specifically looking at the rights of these individuals, to allow the use of restraints may cause harm, including physical or psychological. The rationale stated it was done to protect them or the rights of others. These clients often are not included in this discussion. The third question, is the use of restraints in seclusion ethical? What does the literature and ethical code indicate? Well, according to the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts, there are many that address the issues surrounding seclusion and restraints. For example, 2.05 addresses the rights of clients are paramount, and the analyst should support the client's legal rights and prerogatives. 2.09 talks about the treatment and intervention. Clients have the right to effective treatment based on current research, and it should be adapted to the individual client. They always have the obligation to advocate and educate the client about scientifically supported and the most effective treatments available. 4.02, involving clients in planning and consent. Behavior analysts should always involve the client when planning and the consent when it involves a behavior change program, including restraints and seclusions. 4.08, considerations regarding punishment procedures. Behavior analysts should recommend reinforcement rather than punishment whenever possible. 4.09, least restrictive procedures. Behavior analysts should always review and appraise the restrictiveness of procedures and always recommend the least restrictive procedures that is likely to be effective. 4.10, avoiding harmful reinforcers. Behavior analysts should minimize the use of items as potential reinforcers that may be harmful to the health and development of the client. This may require excessive motivating operations to be effective. These are just a few of the ethical reasons that touch base when discussing restraints and seclusion. And the last question, what role should a behavior analyst play in interventions involving restraints and seclusions? They should be involved in the creation of the plan, the follow-through of the plan, and they're responsible for making sure the plan is implemented and followed by all individuals. It's also important to understand and know the guidelines that are set forth by the agency for which you are working for. This wraps up our restraint and seclusion debate. Thank you for joining us today.